We are going to discuss in this chapter deploying and configuring the DHCP service. So what we will cover in this presentation is how to deploy and configure DHCP. We need to understand the DHCP, how to design a DHCP infrastructure, deploy DHCP server, and using the relay agent. The advantage of DHCP, or the function of DHCP, it automatically configures the IP address and other TCP/IP settings on your network. You will configure a pool of addresses, we call them scope, and you allow the computers to claim this IP address, and once the lease is about to expire, they will reclaim it to use it again, or maybe get another IP address. It will save your time as a network administrator. It will prevent configuration errors also, no duplication. You don't want to end up giving the same IP address to different computers, then this will cause problems. The DHCP consists of 3 components: the DHCP server application, the DHCP client. I mean, you can tell from the name. The server application is installed on the server, and it will respond to the requests from the client. The DHCP client, it is installed on the client computer, and it will request from the server the TCP/IP configuration, and it will apply it to the client. Then we have the DHCP communication protocol, of course. This will define the format and sequences of the messages exchanged by DHCP clients and servers. We have 3 different address allocation methods by DHCP. It provides you with 3 options for assigning the IP addresses. We have the dynamic allocation. So you configure a scope, that's the main method. And the IP addresses, they are given specific time, we call it lease time. So the DHCP servers only lease addresses to clients with this method. We have the automatic allocation. Here, the DHCP permanently assigns an IP address to a client computer from a scope. It is essentially dynamic allocation with indefinite lease. So the automatic is similar to dynamic with one difference or one exception. It's that it is indefinite lease. Then we have the manual allocation. The DHCP server permanently assigns a specific IP address to a specific computer on the network. It is called a reservation. You use manually allocated addresses for computers that must have the same IP address all time, such as your email server, your file server, okay, web server, exchange server, print server. Their IP addresses are there all the time. You don't want to change it every 5 days or every week. Indefinitely. These are the vendor information extensions, okay, for the DHCP. We have the subnet mask. So this specifies which part of the IP address is the host and which part is the network. The router specifies the IP address of your router or gateway. Domain name server or DNS. specifies the IP address of the server the clients will use for DNS name resolution. Host name specifies the DNS host name the client system will use. Domain name specifies the name of the DNS name domain on which the system will reside. These are all given through the vendor information extensions. Also, these options provides parameters that govern the DHCP lease negotiation and renewal process, requested IP address, used by the client to request a particular IP address, lease time, this is what we just talked about, specify the duration of dynamically allocated IP address. So lease time is there only in the dynamic allocation. Server identifier specifies the IP address of the server involved in a DHCP transaction. This is used by the client to address unicast, or unicast meaning only to one machine. So it's sending a unicast, not broadcast. So it is sending to that specific DHCP server. Parameter request list, it's used by the client to send a list of requested configuration options. Message carries an error message from the server to the client, which is DHCP negative acknowledgement, DHCP NAK. Then we have the renewal T1 time value. Specify the time period that must elapse before an IP address lease enters the renewing state. Okay. Rebinding time, or T2, specifies the time period that must elapse before an IP address lease enters the rebinding state. Okay. So what happens? T1 is usually 50%. When your machine or client reaches 50% of the duration, it enters T1 time, which is renewal time. Okay, so the client enters the renewing state and begins generating DHCP request message and transmitting them as a unicast to that DHCP server. Unicast, I am just sending to the DHCP server which provided me the service after 50% of the time. If the server does not respond and I reach T2 or time 2, which is 87.5 of the lease time, then I enter the rebinding time or rebinding state and I begin transmitting the DHCP request message as broadcast to everyone in an attempt to solicit an IP address assignment from any available DHCP server in the network. Okay, so at T1 it's unicast, at T2 it is broadcast, because I am about to finish. If the server receives the DHCP request message from a client, it can respond with either acknowledge to approve the lease renewal, or negative acknowledgement, NAK, which terminates the lease. If the client receives no response to its DHCP request message by the time the lease expires, or if it receives DHCP NAK, the client releases its IP address and returns to the initial state and start from the beginning. Okay. All TCP IP communication then ceases, terminated, except for transmission of DHCP discover broadcast, which is logic. the DHCP message types. We have I just mentioned this DHCP discover. We have the DHCP offer. It's used by the server to offer IP address to requesting client. We have the DHCP request, used by the client to accept or renew an IP address assignment. DHCP decline, it's used by the client to reject an offered IP address. So the second one only, this is used by server. The others are by clients. We have also by server, they do the DHCP acknowledge, to acknowledge client's acceptance, and negative acknowledgement, used by server to reject client's acceptance. DHCP release, used by clients to terminate an IP address lease. DHCP inform, used by clients to obtain additional configuration parameters from a server. You need to know, of course, these names. This is the lease negotiation. What we explained here is given to you in a diagram, okay, like a flow chart. Okay.
Do T1, T2.
Yes. So what happened when you start the machine? The client will send a broadcast, DHCP discover, and the server receives that broadcast. If the server has IP address available, it will respond with DHCP offer. If the client accepts it, then the client will send a DHCP request. The DHCP server will check if the IP address is still available, then it will offer it. Server transmit, DHCP acknowledge. Okay, and so.
We'll be using diagrams?
The diagram is explanation of that page, summary.
بس موديل يعني ما راح يكون في الكويز او شيء.
If the server does not have available IP address, it will discard the message. Okay. So here when we say server have IP address, this is the only server who will respond. Because you send broadcast, many servers will receive the message. The one who has will respond. This is the DHCP lease renewal diagram. When you reach T1, the client will send unicast. Okay, you need to know that. And if everything is okay, the DHCP server will renew the IP address. And the server will send DHCP acknowledge. If it is no response, or the server cannot renew, it will respond with an AK, negative acknowledgement. So lease is terminated. Okay. So you reach T2 time, 87.5 of the time. And imagine you have your lease 100 days. After 87.5 days, you enter the rebinding state. Then you will send the broadcast to any server, all servers. Oh, who have IP address? I am about to get disconnected. Okay. So this is how it is done. Okay. Whether it's a diagram or you are asked short answer, you know how to answer. Do you have any questions about this?
This is all based on one network. Sorry.
Yes, yes.
Same network.
Yeah, domain in the network. Yes, we are talking about Windows Server 2019 networks. To design a DHCP infrastructure, your server is capable theoretically to support many thousands of clients. Okay, theoretically, but we need to consider in our design practical things. Okay. Virtually all enterprise networks require more than one DHCP server. So, because DHCP relies on broadcast messages which have limitations. Remember I said they use broadcast. Broadcast has limitation. Broadcast cannot go through the router. Okay. So the first infrastructure is called distributed DHCP infrastructure. So I have here DHCP server, more than one DHCP server. Okay. So the DHCP infrastructure has some advantages, like your client have ready access to their DHCP server. So I am putting a DHCP server in each network. So all the clients in that network, they are happy because they can have DHCP quick response. All right. So this is one advantage. Also, you don't have to worry about DHCP traffic adding to the overall traffic on your routers. Okay, because the traffic is local for DHCP. I have this network, I have a DHCP for them. So when they request, it is responding. Their request does not need to travel to another network. Okay, but what is the disadvantage? Who can tell me? You need to configure large number of DHCP servers. Budget, work by your administrator, maintenance, okay? But it is good when you need to have redundant and fault tolerance in your network. It is better if you are able to have many DHCP servers. Now there is another infrastructure option which is called, first this is a diagram for a distributed, you look here, each network have their own DHCP server. Okay, here we have a DHCP server. In each LAN, each network, yeah. So if we show you this diagram, what kind of infrastructure is this? This is a distributed. Okay, this we might ask you in the quiz or in the exam. Okay, the other one is centralized DHCP server. So you are having one centralized powerful DHCP that is serving your network. Okay, but it is relying on relay agent. So the DHCP relay agent, what is it? It is a software component that receives the DHCP broadcast traffic on the subnet, and then it sends it to particular DHCP servers on at least one other subnet. That's the function of the relay agent, DHCP relay agent. Now, what is the advantage of centralized DHCP infrastructure? Reduced administration work, because you only have one DHCP server. You can configure, you can, okay?
Reduce budget.
Yeah, it will need less servers, of course. But what is the disadvantage?
Overload.
Yeah, it is putting overhead on your server that is running the DHCP and on the subnet, because all the traffic is coming to them, the request coming only to one server, and that server is in one subnet. The distributed and centralized represent the extremes. Centralized cost little, distributed cost more. We have something in the middle. It's called hybrid DHCP infrastructure. Is one that uses multiple DHCP servers on different subnets, but does not necessarily require a DHCP server on every subnet. We call this hybrid. Yeah. Okay. No, it is called hybrid. Hybrid. Okay. All right. This is a centralized. Here I have one DHCP with relay agent, and on the other networks I have only relay agent. Okay. This is relay agent. This is my central DHCP. So all the traffic is coming where? Here. From here, also here. Imagine you have 10 networks. Okay, I am saving, but it is too much traffic for this part. So there are some ways to regulate your DHCP traffic. There are some factors and choices. First, place DHCP server close to the clients. Adjust the lease duration so there are fewer renewals. Okay. Make the lease duration unlimited, if possible. If possible, not always. These are all if possible and if it's needed. Okay. How do we install DHCP server? DHCP is built in or packaged as a role in Windows Server. We can do it as I've just shown you in the tutorial, as a role. You add it as a role. Manage server, then add role. We will do this in the lab. So those that we will do in the lab, I will just move to the next slide. The DHCP server operates independently, so you must install the service and configure scopes on every computer that will function as a DHCP server. Okay. First, you will need to create the scope. Okay. What is a scope? Scope is a range of IP addresses on a particular subnet that are selected for allocation by a DHCP server. We do this by using the DHCP snap-in for Microsoft Management Console, MMC. When you go to Server Manager, we will open the DHCP snap-in and we will configure the scope in the lab. It's easy. Here is the options here. This is your DHCP console. You click on create a new scope. You give a scope name. This is the start IP address of the scope, like for example 192.168.1.1, and this is the end IP address 192.1.168.1.100 maybe. Okay, this is configuration settings that propagate to the DHCP client. This is the length of your subnet mask. If it's a class C, then it will be 256.256.256.0. So the length of the subnet mask is how much? 24. 8 plus 8 plus 8. The prefix will be 24. 8 plus 8 plus 8. So the length of the prefix, this is the length of the prefix. This is the exclusion.
What is the use of the start IP address and the end?
This is the beginning of the scope. And I have created a scope, a pool, so that I will start leasing. So what is the start IP address? And what is the end? How many IP addresses I have in the pool? Okay, available for us in the pool. You have to specify how many IP addresses. Then we put some exclusion. Okay, the first 10 IP addresses, oh, please don't dynamically assign them. I want to assign them manually. Okay. So I will put the exclusion and then next. Here we specify the lease duration. And the lease duration can be in days, hours, and minutes. No seconds. Okay. By default, it is 8 days. By default. Now they will ask you, do you want to configure the DHCP options, like the DNS, the gateway, the router? We say yes, because I want to configure them. So here we will put the router or default gateway. We will do this in the lab. I will show you with how to choose, which one to choose. And then you choose also the domain DNS. Do you want to activate the scope now? If you said no, the scope is there, but it's not activated. It's not applied. So yes, we want to activate.
The duration of the scope will be started from activation?
Yeah, from activate. Yes, from activation. 8 days from activation. Now you need to, the Windows Server support 2 kinds of options. The scope options, it's supplied only to the DHCP clients, and server options supplied to all the DHCP clients receiving addresses from the server. So the scope option is from the scope, and the server is from the server. To configure DHCP options, you open the scope option dialog box. To create a reservation, what is a reservation? A reservation is a manually allocated address. It is used for computers whose IP address must remain the same or static, not dynamic, static. Like domain controllers, DNS, web servers, and it allows you to manage all of your IP addresses through the DHCP. That's the advantage of doing it through the DHCP, through reservation. This is a reservation screen. If you want to create a new reservation, then you will put a reservation name, the IP address, the MAC address of the machine, okay? And the supported type is both the DHCP and boot P. Deploying a DHCP relay agent, that's if we are doing a centralized or hybrid DHCP infrastructure. By the way, nowadays many routers are capable of functioning as a DHCP relay agent. However, if they are not doing that, you can configure a Windows Server 2019 computer to function as a relay agent in your network. This is the summary of what we have learned in this lecture. So please let's read and answer your question.